anyone who does not love Dan Dunnahoo. I know plenty of people who don't like you guys, but I've never met someone who doesn't care and love Dr. D. And so, Dr. D, again, welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you for teaching us, and we love you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that warm welcome, and thank you for having me. Before I start, I do have to tell you a couple of little stories. Luke mentioned that he didn't really know I was going to be here. And I didn't know Luke and Kate were playing until Thursday. I think I talked to Michael, and he said, oh, yeah, our regular folks aren't going to be there. Luke and Kate are going to play. And I said, well, that's great. And one of the reasons that's great is that the very first time I ever did this, it was for my church, Mount Gilead. It's probably been how many years ago? 15 years ago? Something like that. And Luke was a teenager at the time. Anyway, I did it. Well, I'll save some of the story for later, but about 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, I got a call from a pastor here in Griffin, Pastor Jason Lyle. Some of you probably know him, Open Range Church. He said, I understand you know how to make pottery, and I'm going to do this sermon, and would you come and do the pottery for me? And I said, well, I'd be glad to, but how did you find out about me? And Luke was leading worship at that church at the time, and when Pastor started talking about it, Luke said, well, I know a guy. So the very first time I did it outside my own church was with Luke singing, and so it's a neat thing that God orchestrates sometimes. And that song, You Make Beautiful Things Out of the Dust. You know, in Genesis we're told that God took what? The dust of the earth and formed us from that. You know what the dust of the earth is? It's clay. When you're riding down a dirt road and it's been really dry and all that dust comes up and it settles on the bushes on the side and they turn gray, you know what that dust is? It's clay. If you could gather enough of it and put water in it, you'd have clay. So anyway, enough about that. The other interesting thing, I almost don't have to read my scriptures because Michael and I did not communicate, and the other folks, and they pretty much read my script, so I'll be going over some of those again. But I want to start in a little bit different place, a place you might not expect for a sermon like this. It's in Ephesians chapter 2. I'll just read it. As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the Spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath. But because of His great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. And God raised us up with Christ and seated us with Him in the heavenly realms in Christ Jesus, in order that in the coming ages He might show the incomparable riches of His grace, expressed in His kindness to us in Christ Jesus. For it is by grace you've been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. And these last two verses are particularly applicable to what I'm going to talk about tonight, or today. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. Some modern translations or paraphrase versions of the Bible, when they get down to verse 10 where it says we are God's handiwork, I think the Message even uses the word masterpiece. We're God's masterpiece. Have you ever thought of yourself as a work of art, as a masterpiece, as something created by God with a specific purpose in mind? Down here towards the end, God's handiwork created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. He has a plan for you. He knows what He wants you to do. He knows all the details of your life before you do. And He guides you through those things. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk some. I'm going to make pots. It's going to be part testimony. You'll see how it all comes together. But right now you want to see me make a pot, don't you? Okay, here we go. This is clay. It's Georgia clay. I go down to Lizella and buy the clay from a man who produces it. When I say produces it, I mean he digs it out of the ground with a backhoe and dries it out and sifts it and puts water in it and mixes it up. So it's perfectly, just right out of the ground, clay from right here in Georgia. The first thing I'm doing is this is called wedging the clay, kneading the clay. This does 2 or 3 things. It makes sure that there are no hard or soft spots in the clay. It blends it all together. It gets rid of any air bubbles that might be in the clay, any defects. If you go ahead and make a pot without doing this, and there's an air bubble trapped in there or a chunk of harder clay, then it will just throw you off. You won't be able to complete the pot like you intended to. It'll cause it to collapse and fail. So, even in this step, I'm getting this clay ready to even be used. The other thing it does, and you see that little shape? Some people say it looks like a duck. The old traditional people call this the ram's head because it looks kind of like the snout of a ram and the curly horns on the edges. Anyway, but what that's doing, believe it or not, is it's setting up a spiral motion in the clay. So, when I get ready to put this piece of clay on the wheel to use it, I have to throw it down the right way. So this is think of like a roll of paper towels. Okay? If I put it down this way, here's the end, the last paper towel, right? And if I start spinning the wheel and I put my hands on the clay, it's going to want to unwind, right? Does that make sense? Can you visualize that? Paper towels? So I have to put it on the wheel in the right rotation so that it's working with my hands, not against my hands. Some of that'll preach too if you think about it. But I know, first of all, how to prepare the clay. I know how to set it on the wheel so that it doesn't fight against me, and all that kind of thing. Here we go. The first thing to do is to set the wheel in motion, and then I try to throw this clay down as close as I can to the center. That wasn't close enough. You can fix that, but that was really not close enough. You'd think I'd done this before, but I do like for it to be fairly close to the middle when I start. You'll see why in just a minute. I have to get the wheel going really fast. Okay, and then I have to get my hands really wet. You guys are sitting in the splash zone, by the way. Not really. Okay, the first step is to get that lump of clay centered in the wheel. So that's why I want to throw it as close as I can to the center. But then I'm going to take my hands and put a lot of pressure on the clay and push it into the center. Now, what you can't tell, or maybe you can, that takes a lot of strength. Like when I'm pushing that clay into the center, I'm pushing really, really hard. And in fact, watch what I do with my feet. See how I put that foot back there against that back post? Because I'm pushing with my foot and my whole body. And I put my elbow right here against my hip so that I push with my hip to center the clay. So it's not just my hands, it's all of me. Okay, so now that lump's pretty well centered, spinning. I'm going to find the center of that lump with my thumb and push straight down. So I'm opening that lump of clay out to make it useful. If it was just a lump like that, what good is that? You don't want to be a lump. So I've opened that out, but right now it's like a pot, sort of. With really thick walls and not much space inside. So now I'm going to open that out. That same thumb inside, I'm just going to kind of squeeze it over towards my fingers so that it opens out. It gets a little bit bigger. Now I can get my other hand inside. I'm doing the same thing. I'm just kind of pulling over like this towards my outside hand. Okay. So that's got it opened out. Now, that looks more like a bowl, doesn't it? But it's still kind of short and squat. And the walls are way thicker than they need to be. Right now the walls are about that thick, which is not what you need. Okay. Now here comes the fun part. I'm just going to do it, and then you can, I'll explain what's happening in just a minute. Here we go. Okay, see how much taller that got? What I'm doing is I'm getting the clay wet right now. What I'm doing, my outside hand, I make sort of a fist and I bring this knuckle out. So like this knuckle right here is running against the side of the pot. On the inside of the pot, I'm just using the tips of these two fingers, and they're directly opposite from each other. One on the outside, one on the inside. And I squeeze together very gently, and I move up. And as I move up, the clay moves up with me. So let me do that again. Okay. Got a little bit taller that time. Just getting rid of a little excess weight right there. Okay. The thing about that is that's called raising or pulling the walls of the pot. Whereas centering takes a lot of strength. And like I said, I was bracing against the wheel. I was pushing really hard. This takes a lot of touch, a lot of finesse. You have to know just the right amount of pressure. You have to know just how quickly to move up. You have to... It's a little difficult to explain until you've tried. How many of you have ever tried this? Okay, a few of you. It's hard to get the hang of that raising, isn't it? Okay? Because if your fingertips and your knuckle are just the least bit out of alignment, first of all, nothing will happen. Like you'll move and it won't come up. I have even seen people do that and the pot actually got shorter because the pressure's not right. Okay? So your fingertips and everything, it's just... And it's a feel. It's the thing that you develop. The potter just knows. And the other thing that's happening is you read the clay. Like when I opened this bag of clay this morning, it was a fresh bag, and I tried a couple of pots just to sort of, practice. And this clay is kind of slack, which means it's a little too soft. It makes it really easy to center, and it makes it easy to pull, but it gets weak. So I have to know how far I can push this piece of clay. Like, there are some pots I wouldn't try to make with this particular lump of clay because it's just a little too weak and it would collapse. So it's going to have some bearing on what I can make today. But anyway, but you get the idea. I know, I can feel what this clay needs. So I know when to press and how to press. And just what kind of pressure to use on the clay. And this is pretty much it. All I'm going to do now, this third pull, I'm not really going for any more height. I'm going to shape the pot. So I'm going to try to sort of round it out a little bit, and we'll see what happens. If I usually don't mess up a pot on purpose, but if I do, it's okay. All I'm doing now is pressing out a little bit more with the inside hand. The outside hand is just sort of keeping it from going too far. Okay. A little bit more right through here. I hear my granddaughter. Isn't it something how you recognize the voices? Yeah. She's never seen this. Jane, pay attention. Anyway, that's pretty much it for this pot. It's done. The last thing I like to do with any of my pots is take this little strip of leather and you just kind of hold it against the rim of the pot very gently. It sort of polishes that rim, brings a nice shine to it. And then the last thing, I've got to make myself a little room here. I have to remove, I thought I had dropped something. I have to remove the pot from the wheel. And to do that, I use this wire. While the wheel is still spinning, I'm just going to take this wire and pass it under the pot. That separates it from the wheel. And then I have to very carefully lift that pot. Okay, now, maybe you can see either on some of these I made earlier or on that one, especially of you that are up close. Can you see my handprints on the pot where I picked it up? Can you see that? Just a little bit maybe. The cool thing about that is those handprints are there forever. When that pot is dried and fired, and even when it's glazed, those handprints are still there. The handprints of the potter are still on the pot as long as that pot's around, just like God's handprints should be on you, you know. So, that's one pot. Time for another scripture. This is pretty familiar. You've probably heard this one many times. From Jeremiah chapter 18. This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Go down to the potter's house, and there I will give you my message. Now, this is Jeremiah writing, so when he says, so I, Jeremiah, went down to the potter's house, and I saw him working at the wheel. But the pot he was shaping from the clay was marred in his hands, so the potter formed it into another pot, shaping it as it seemed best to him. Then the word of the Lord came to me, and he said, can I not do with you, Israel, as this potter does, declares the Lord? Like clay in the hand of the potter, so are you in my hand, Israel. Jeremiah, if you know much about Jeremiah, we're not going to go into the whole book of Jeremiah today, but he was a prophet. He kept warning the people of Israel, reminding them of their transgressions and how they needed to do what they should do and get back to the ways that God had intended for them. And Jeremiah, in earthly terms, was not a particularly successful prophet because the people were not turning and they weren't listening. And the Bible talks several places about the people of Israel being a stiff-necked people and a stubborn people and a rebellious people, and they were, just like we are sometimes. But eventually, this is about the early to middle part of the book of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah's getting frustrated. He's saying, this isn't working. And so God sends him down to the potter's house, and he watches the potter work. And like I said, I don't usually mess up a pot on purpose. But if you mess up a pot, You take that piece of clay and you just force it back down and recenter it, and you try again. And you make something else out of that same piece of clay. So that's what Jeremiah observed. And the lesson for Jeremiah was God is in control. He said, it's not you. Don't worry, Jeremiah. It's not you. Don't worry that they're not listening. I'm in control. I can change them, and I will change them when the time comes. Just like he can do that with us. I have to tell you a little story now. How I got into making pottery. Because this is an important part of my testimony. Again, the lesson of the potter's house is that God, first of all, He makes you. That those verses from Ephesians, the reason I like to start with that, it sort of like encapsulates the whole gospel into those few verses. Paul does that in several places in his various letters, but I like that one because it finishes up with the part about the masterpiece and the handiwork. He makes us. Even when we rebel against them, He redeems us. Once He redeems us, He has a plan and a purpose for us that He set out before we were even thought of, except by Him. Right? And even if we get off track on that purpose, He can bring us back. You know? So this part, I'm going to talk a little bit about my testimony and how I think God has worked His purpose in my life. When I was a young child, and I have some older relatives here who can probably remember this, I did not speak. I was very shy. I would not talk to people other than my immediate family. I was just really reserved, socially awkward, whatever. And so I grew up in the Baptist church. And, I don't know how things are now in all Baptist churches, but at the time, when you realized your condition and you asked Jesus to save you, you were expected to walk down the aisle of the church in front of those hundreds of people and go down to the front and tell the pastor, that you were making your profession of faith. Well, I knew I was saved from the time I was about 9 years old. But I was so afraid and so shy and so scared and did not know what to do or say that I could not bring myself to walk down the aisle until I was 18 years old. So for 9 years, every time they gave that invitation, I held on to the back of that pew and I said, I'm not doing it. But something, maturity, whatever, it finally did happen. And I walked down to the front and I told the preacher, now this is the funny part. We had a guest speaker that day and things got a little crazy. And because what was supposed to happen after you do that is the preacher says, here's Danny. He's come down. He's made his profession of faith. All of you who are welcome him into, say amen. And everybody would say amen. And, Well, he forgot to do that. Okay. That night, I was down in the youth room. We had a place in the basement, pool table. I was down there shooting pool like I always did. And the preacher came down, and he walked over to me. He said, come here. So I sat down with him. He said, you made your profession of faith this morning, didn't you? I said, yes, I did. And he said, and I forgot what I was supposed to do. I said, yes, you did. And he said, well, you'll just have to come back next week. Which was okay by that point. And I did, and he explained to everybody what had happened, and we all had a big laugh. But shortly after that, within just a month or two, the youth choir at our church was putting on a musical. It was called Joy. That was the name of the musical. And we had a new minister of music who didn't know my past, the fact that I was, so shy and everything. So he said, I want you to take one of the lead parts. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And so I did. I had one of the lead speaking parts. Fortunately for me, that I did not have a singing part, but I had a lead speaking part. And the young lady who had the female lead was a young lady that I was somewhat interested in. And her name was Joy. And in the play, we played a boyfriend and girlfriend. And so I had to hold her hand for the play. And let's just say sparks flew. And 4 years later, we were married. So that's how we met, kind of. We knew each other from school a little bit, but anyway. Now, the potter's part. Joy took art her senior year in high school. So did I the year before, but we didn't have a potter's wheel that year. The year Joy was in there, the teacher got a potter's wheel. And Joy liked doing it, and she came home from school one day, and we were hanging out like young people do, and she said, I really like that pottery stuff. Do you think you could build me a potter's wheel? And I said, of course I can build you a potter's wheel. You know, I didn't know how to build a potter's wheel, but I found out, and I built her a potter's wheel. And I still have it. It's a little electric wheel, and we would sit in her mom and dad's basement and make pots. How's that for a date? You know? And so she introduced me to the idea even of making pottery. And so I got interested in it. And when I went off to college, I was a drawing and painting major, but I took all of my electives in pottery. So I really love doing this. And but that's how I got started. Anyway, and you'll hear more of the story in a little while. Let's make another pot. You getting bored now, aren't you? No. It's okay, Jane. Again, I have to get the clay prepared. That was better. And once again, centering the clay just by pressing in with a lot of force. This time I'm going to make a bowl. Now, that's another thing about the potter. Like, when you start to make a pot, you know in advance what you're going to make. Right? Like, I sort of plan to do that one that way. And this time I'm going to make a bowl, well, you know, a more open bowl shape. So that will affect everything I do. So when I center the lump, this time I want the lump to be a little bit shorter and broader, because the pot's going to be shorter and broader. If I'm making a really tall pot, then I'll leave the lump fairly tall. Okay? So I know the plans I have for this pot. Does that sound familiar? I know the plans I have for this pot. And so from the very beginning, I know how it needs to be shaped. I know just where to push. Again, opening out the pot, spreading that out even wider. That song, Beautiful Things, that Luke and Kate did. Sometimes when I've done this, and Luke has sung with me, that's been, 4 or 5 times now at least. Sometimes I'll do a pot during that song. I've got it down to where I can finish in just the right time. We didn't do it that way this time. It happens every now and then. Okay. You can't see it probably. But right now, I can tell. See, this is Jeremiah chapter 18 at work. This pot is not quite spoiled, but it's gotten off center. Can any of you see that? It's got a little wobble in it. So I've got to fix that before I can go any further. So here we go. I'm going to push it back and bring it back into center. If I had tried to raise the pot with it not being centered, it would have made a mess. Okay, that's better. The other thing I did that day, I made my profession of faith at the church. The guest speaker was a missionary. And the invitation was, the usual invitation as far as salvation and everything. But he had the additional challenge for all of us to commit our lives to doing what God wanted to do with us. If that meant being a missionary somewhere, if that meant being a Sunday school teacher, if that meant whatever it meant, but just being open to what God would have you to do. And I made that commitment that day too. And again, it's one of the things that's kind of brought me to where I am today. Michael talked about the mission trip coming up. We had hoped to go in this past July, but just a number of things did not quite work out, and so we've decided to postpone that trip. And now it looks like it'll probably be next July. But in fact, about the day I decided, this is just not going to work this year. This is not going to come together. And I was really discouraged and a little disappointed. And I'm thinking, well, God, did I get out ahead of you? What happened? Tell me what happened. And I was actually, there's a place I go to relax over in the country. And I was over there and I was sitting in the porch swing and feeling sorry for myself, disappointed. And I got a text. Technology works even out in the middle of nowhere. I got a text from a former student, a young lady. And the text said, I understand you're planning a mission trip to Uganda. And it's going to be an art-based mission trip. Like we're going to go do art activities with the orphans there in Uganda. And also spiritually based. But, the vehicle will be the art. And she's an art teacher now. She's one of my former students. She's an art teacher now. But she said, I understand you're going on this mission trip. And I said, yes. And she said, well, I want to go. I said, well, when can you go? She said, not until next summer. So it was just kind of confirmation to me that waiting was not a bad thing. And she just has some wonderful ideas about the trip, too. So I went from being disappointed to being excited. So anyway. Again, this clay is a little bit slack. I can feel this bowl getting weak, so I'm not going to do a whole lot more with it. Bowl is the simplest shape to make. I think the clay kind of wants to spread out anyway. So, again, I'm being sensitive to this piece of clay, and I'm not going to force it to do anything that it's not capable of. So, I better stop while I'm ahead. Okay, so back to my story. This is one of the scriptures that was read earlier, if I'm not mistaken. Isaiah 29:16, you turn things upside down as if the potter were thought to be like the clay. Shall what is formed say to the one who formed it, you did not make me? Or can the pot say to the potter, you know nothing? This clay doesn't have a will. If you've tried this, you know that sometimes it feels like it has a will, like it's fighting against you. It feels like it is anyway. But, it doesn't have a will. We do have a will, and we do fight sometimes against what God wants us to do or be. But this pot can't tell me what it needs to be. Again, my hands are on the clay, and I can feel what's happening, so I know where to push, where to touch, how far to go with it. Don't you think that your Creator knows the same things about you? What are you capable of through Him? How far can He push you? It's almost not right to say push, but you know what I mean. He can challenge you. He can expect things of you because He knows you can do it. So if you ever feel that challenge and you think, well, not me, God. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not whatever enough. If you feel that call, my challenge to you is to answer it. Because it's not you that's doing it anyway. It's not me that's doing this today. Inside me is still that scared, shy little kid. You know, I can do this now, but I still get really nervous. Can you tell? I still get really nervous when I do it. But, okay. The other thing you notice about me is that I don't have a watch. Sorry. Okay, and this part was read earlier too, but I really want to reread this one because this is really important to what I need to talk about next. This is Isaiah chapter 43, verses 1 and 2. But now this is what the Lord says, He who created you, Jacob, He who formed you, Israel. Do not fear, I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine. Okay? That's the same thing from Ephesians. He calls us, He equips us, whatever. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. We all go through things in our lives that are difficult. You can think of that as, you know, passing through the waters or wading through a river or going through a fire. Fires can be beneficial. They can be destructive, but they can also be beneficial. You know, people who know about forest resources, forest fires, even though they are destructive, they also solve some issues, some problems that would make the forest choke itself out if it weren't for the fire. They release seeds from pine cones that would not otherwise be released because the heat causes that thing to open up and the seeds come out. So it can also be a regenerative sort of thing in some cases. Well, I have to tell you a little bit more about Joy and my life. And a lot of you know this, but we had a wonderful life. Married for 33 years, dated for 4 years before that, 37 years we were together. But along about 2007 or 8, we began to notice some health issues with Joy, and it started with things like she'd be in the middle of a sentence and couldn't complete the sentence, couldn't come up with the words that she wanted to say. The next thing we started noticing was that her handwriting was declining. I'd be trying to balance the checkbook, and I was looking, and Joy, what does this say? And she'd look at it, and she'd say, I don't know. But her handwriting was getting worse and worse. Make a long story short, in the summer of 2008, we had been to all kinds of doctors, but she was diagnosed with a strange neurological condition called corticobasal degeneration, which is a type of dementia. It's a little bit like Alzheimer's. Most people are kind of familiar with Alzheimer's, except that with Alzheimer's patients, they lose their memory, like they won't even know who their family members are or things like that. Joy never lost her memory, but she lost the ability, over time, she lost the ability to speak. So for about the last 2 years that she lived, she could not speak. She lost the ability to use her hands at all. So for about the last 2 years, she could do absolutely nothing with her hands. Think what that would be like to not be able to eat or to bathe or to brush your own hair or your own teeth or to turn a doorknob. Nothing. Think of all, personal care. She could do nothing with her hands. And so once we realized that she was sick and what the diagnosis was, the doctor told us that day, he said, you might have 10 years to live. So you need to go home and get your affairs in order and all that kind of thing. And I decided that day that I was going to retire as soon as I could do that, to take care of her. At that point, she was still walking, she was still talking, she was still able to do some things, but very quickly she declined. So at the end of the next school year, 2009, I was able to retire and stay home with her. And that was my job. I made that commitment, like I told you, the day I made my profession of faith. I made that commitment to do whatever God called me to do. For the 28 years that I taught school, that was my call, I'm convinced. I was there for a reason. Some of you here in this room went through my classes. And thank Michael for his words. It sounds almost like bragging, but please don't take it that way. But I think the reason my students loved me, because they knew I loved them. You know, there are limits on what you can say and what you can do in a public school as a believer. But there's no limit on praying for your students. There's no limit on living it out in front of them. And again, I'm convinced that for those 28 years, that's what I was supposed to do. Well, when Joy got sick, there was no question in my mind that what I was supposed to do was to take care of her. So I left my job and stayed home with her. And she lived for another 3 years. So that was a trial for her and for me. Mostly for her. She was the one who was going through it. But she remained optimistic. She remained cheerful. She did not complain. We traveled. We went all over the place. We could go anywhere. We went to Italy. She loved Disney World. We went to Disney World 2 or 3 times a year. At some point, she got interested in space shuttle launches. I don't know why. We were watching TV one day. She couldn't talk anymore. We were watching TV, and there was a space shuttle launch, and she couldn't really point, but she kind of took her hand and went like this. And I said, "What? What?" She look at TV, and I don't understand. I said, "Does that mean you want to try to go see a space shuttle launch?" And she shook her head. So we went to the last 3 of the space shuttle launches. We would camp out in the parking lot. You know, just amazing things that we were able to do. But the reason she was able to do those things is because someone was with her. I had my hands on her. We would be sitting, I'm sorry, I'm going on and on. We would be sitting at the house, unable to speak, unable to do anything. I just knew what she needed. I mean, I lived with her for 33 years, so I knew what she needed. And I would just take care of things. And I loved doing it. But she would get anxious if I was away from her for very long. So when we were sitting there on the sofa watching TV, I had to have my hand on her leg or around her, holding her hand, whatever. When we went out in public, I had to hold her hand all the time when we were walking, because if I didn't, she might walk off. So what I'm telling you is, again, for about those last 2 years, we were physically touching each other almost 24 hours a day. And if I ever got away from her, she would get anxious. You know, she would fret. She would get up and pace back and forth. At church, our Sunday school rooms were right next to each other. And I would take her to her room, and I would go to my room. And every Sunday, after about 15 or 20 minutes, somebody would knock on the door, and they'd say, "She can't sit still anymore." And so I would go and sit with her in the sanctuary and wait for Sunday school to be over. But my hand was on her, and as long as my hand was on her, she could do anything. She would go anywhere. People, when we got ready to go to Italy, they said, "Are you sure? Do you realize what you're doing?" I said, "She can do it if I'm with her." When my hands are on this pot, it's growing, it's changing, it's becoming what I want it to be. When God's hands are on me, I'm growing, I'm changing, I'm becoming what God wants me to be. Think about that. You know, how often can that happen too? You know, we talk about Jeremiah chapter 18, spoiling the pot and then remaking the pot. At different phases in your life, you're going to need different things. You know? And God, first of all, He already knows. He already has it planned. We forget that sometimes, but He already has it planned. So He knows what you're going to need. He's going to provide it. Again, if you're walking in His will, if you're doing what He's called you to do, you're not going to fail. He won't let you fail. He'll keep His hand on you, and you can do anything as long as His hand is on you. Okay. I should make one more pot, and then I've got just a little more to talk about. I think I'll just leave that there. And I'm going to use all the rest of this clay. and see how big of a pot I can make. How are we doing on time? I just okay. That piece is ready. That's the best one yet. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot because I'm going to try to do this faster. And I can do it faster when I'm not talking. But the process is the same. Just get my clay centered. Okay, this time I am going to try to make a taller pot. So I've left the lump a little bit taller. Just like I said before, I know from the beginning what I'm going to try to do, so. That opened out. Here we go with that raising thing again. I always tell people when they're trying to learn this part, centering is not all that difficult. It takes strength, but it's not all that difficult. Opening the pot out, that initial opening is not all that difficult. This is difficult until you learn how. And then it's easy. Some of the pots back there on the counter that Michael put out, I didn't bring a lot of pots today because I sold almost everything I had at a little show I had last month. And everything I sell goes towards funding this mission trip that we're going on. So for the last year and a half or so, and for the next foreseeable future, if you ever see my stuff for sale, 100% of that is going to the mission trip. So I'm not keeping anything. Anyway, but some of those pots back there were made by a young lady who came to my house for lessons. Her name is Tina. And I've had several people come by who want to learn, and I'm glad to show them because I like for people to know. But very quickly, some people it takes a long time to catch on. But I showed Tina one time, and she put her hands on the pot, and she did this. And it was just like perfect. I said, how'd you know how to do that? But anyway, a lot of people have a hard time learning this part. And the illustration I always use is a lot like riding a bicycle. How many of you remember learning how to ride a bicycle? And how many times did you have to try before you could stay up? A lot, right? A lot. You fall over a lot. And people keep telling you, well, it's easy, just pedal and, But then one day, it just happened, right? And you could ride. And you think, well, that was easy. Why couldn't I do that all along? Well, you just have to, you have to learn. Oh, this is the same sort of thing. That hand position and the pressure and everything. If you ever feel it happening in your hands, you've got it. And it's really pretty easy. But here we go. Now, my intention for this is to try to make sort of like a jug. So before I go any further, I'm going to see how it's kind of spreading out. I don't want that. So I'm going to choke this pot back in and cause it to get a little bit narrower at the top. Because this is a rebellious piece of clay. It really is. So I'm not sure it's going to work, but I'll do my best to try to show you how this works. But I'm choking it in at the top. And I have to do that gradually so that the pot doesn't collapse. Yeah. Y'all pray for this pot. I'll see what I can do, but here we go. But what I'm doing by choking the pot in at the top a little bit, I don't ever want it to get too wide, but because the clay has like a memory, it's almost like elastic. And if it's ever stretched out too far and you try to bring it back in, it'll just fold in on itself and make a mess. So I'm trying to get that top to come in. Come on, come on, come on. There we go. That's better. Maybe it will work. Okay, I'm trying to raise a little bit more. Let this part get a little fatter. Okay. It's getting there. There's hope. What I'm doing now with just my fingertips is I left a little thick clay here at the top, and I'm taking that clay and I'm trying to pull it over towards the center. This is going to be embarrassing when it collapses, but it won't be the first time. Whoop. I feel the same way. Really, I'm beginning to think this is not going to work, but I'll try. Just bear with me. This is a hard thing to do under the best of circumstances, and this is not the best of circumstances. This is embarrassing. I'm not going to be able to make a jug after all. So you have a perfect illustration here of Jeremiah chapter 18. I can't do what I intended to do with this pot. It's just not going to work. But that doesn't mean it's useless. Okay, I'm going to save this pot and make it into something else entirely. Looks better already, doesn't it? This is the most miserable pot I've ever made for one. I'm telling you, I feel badly for you having to watch this. But there we go. And I better leave well enough alone. It's a little... see how the top, I don't know if you can see the top from there, but it's all out of whack. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to trim away the pot where it's crooked, where it doesn't need to be. And I'm going to leave it with a nice even rim now. That's a pretty good illustration, too. If you let Him, God will trim away the parts of your life that aren't helpful, that aren't productive for you. Okay, I really better leave this alone now. not quite as big a disaster as it was for a while there. It's not the prettiest pot I've ever made, but it'll function. It'll still be a pot. Back to the story of Joy and I. As she continued to decline, she went through a phase. I don't know, the last month or so that she lived, where she couldn't be still. She had to be walking all the time, and which was fine during the day. But at night, it got a little bit difficult because, trying to sleep, trying to get her to sleep, trying to sleep myself, and so she would just be wandering around the house. I better leave this right here. She would be wandering around the house, bumping into things, falling over things if I wasn't following right along with her. So she wasn't sleeping, I wasn't sleeping, nobody was sleeping. We were exhausted. I had not had a shower in like a week because I couldn't leave her alone long enough to take a shower. I called a friend, and she came over and sat with Joy while I took a shower. But anyway, I realized something had to happen. I wasn't going to keep working. It was just too much, too difficult for her, too difficult for me. So one night I was trying to get her to bed, and I would try different things. I would try turning on the TV to see if that would help her, occupy her, help her settle down. I would talk to her, and that was better. But I can only babble on for so long. And so I was lying in bed one night, and she was struggling to get up. I was not hurting her, but I would physically hold her so that she couldn't get up, because that was better to me than following her around the house all night. So I would hold her. And I was praying. I said, God, you got to give me some help here. I don't know what to do anymore. And just as clear as could be, a voice came to me and said, sing. Now, I'm not much of a singer, but I would sing, and she would just immediately just relax. I would go through my whole repertoire, sometimes 3 or 4 times before she would finally go to sleep. And I was telling that story one time to a friend, and she remembered this verse from Zephaniah. Not one of those things that people preach out of all that often. But this is from Zephaniah, chapter 3, verses 14 through 17. Sing, daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, Israel. Be glad and rejoice with all your heart, daughter Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away your punishment. He has turned back your enemy. The Lord, the King of Israel, is with you. Never again will you fear any harm. On that day they will say to Jerusalem, do not fear Zion, do not let your hands hang limp. And here's the part that really hit me. The Lord your God is with you, the mighty warrior who saves. He will take great delight in you. In his love he will no longer rebuke you, but will rejoice over you with singing. Isn't that amazing to think of, that the God of the universe, the God who created all of this, the God that made you and me, that redeemed you and me, that has a plan for you and me, that he rejoices over us with singing? Think about that right now. God is singing over you and me. Think about that. Anyway, it was just a couple of weeks after that Joy passed away, but I tell you all that, again, that was my purpose for that time, was to take care of her. After she passed away, I didn't know what to do for a while there. I tell you, I did not know what to do. But pretty shortly, I got that call from Pastor Jason. And he said, will you come and do this? And I said, yeah, I can do that. And so I've done this probably 20 times now, different places, churches, Christian schools, whatnot. So this has become part of my purpose now, is to share that story and to share those things with you. And again, the mission trip to Uganda, God put that in my mind a little over a year ago, and I bumped into Michael's dad, Ted, and I said, "Ted, do they have art over there in the orphanages in Uganda?" And he said, "Well, no, not really." I said, "Would it be possible for me to take a group over there and do some things with them?" And you have to know Ted to understand this, but he looked right in my eye and he said, "Pack your bags." So we've been kind of working on the plans ever since. And it's going to come together in God's time, and we're going to go. But I just appreciate the time with you. I appreciate your attention. I appreciate you suffering with me through that last spot. But that's pretty much what I had to share.